One.
Hello again, this is Glenn Maurer, and we're doing another episode of the Next Step TVSB. And as you saw from the beginning, we're going to take a little step into national politics on this episode of the show and discuss Bernie Sanders' campaign for the Democratic nomination for president and whether or not his candidacy as an independent, a socialist, or as a possible Green candidate, well, we sort of a long range, but possible, is a viable choice for Green Party members and people of the progressive left. And in order to discuss this show today, we have with us Robert Bernstein. Robert is a local activist. He's been involved with mostly with the Sierra Club, I think, more famously. He's also heavily involved in sustainable transportation policies for the community. Been around for a good many years in Santa Barbara, in the Santa Barbara area, and famous for his hikes in the Sierra Club, as I recall. Although I've never been on one, I was tempted a few times. But one of the hikes that Robert took, along with a bunch of other people from Santa Barbara in the last few weeks, was to trek on down to Los Angeles. Robert, you were there with whom? Who was in this bus, and where were you going?
So we were going to see Bernie Sanders down in Los Angeles, and it was really an event of a lifetime because I really do believe that he will be our next president. And I've been following Bernie for years now. He's on the Thom Hartmann radio program every week, Brunch with Bernie, for an hour. So I really feel like I know him. And
we have on the TV right now the logo that Bernie 16. It doesn't say Bernie Democrat, it doesn't say Bernie Sanders Vermont, it doesn't say Bernie Independent, it says Bernie 16. So you know Bernie.
I know Bernie. Yeah, he's had a pretty consistent, to me rather modest program that he's laid out for years. The centerpiece is putting people to work with rebuilding infrastructure.
Well, before we get into his program, I want to just talk about the dynamics. I think this is, people in America are so jaded. They're so blasé. You think none of these political events are ever really spontaneously supported, are ever really populist activated. They're mostly programmed by some very wealthy, not just Donald Trump, but very wealthy people who have minions who come out and grab crowds and drag them in and put them on the program. But here's a case, and maybe we get a couple slides of the crowd that headed on down there, some of them. People from Santa Barbara got on a bus in Santa Barbara, and if we can get any of those slides up there, that'd be helpful. There's one, political revolution. There's a Bernie shirt. And this is, I think, I'm not sure if this is in Santa Barbara or after you arrived.
No, this is at the Coliseum. This is my friend Ibrahim, yeah.
And behind him are the people who are on the bus. And there's another, now there's a crowd, not just your bus, but I assume that this is a crowd of a huge crowd of people that were outside the sports arena.
Yeah, the sports arena instantly filled, and in the overflow area filled, so it was pretty packed in there. A lot of excited fans of Bernie.
I was, as we were discussing before the show, I grew up in this neighborhood pretty much. I went to the university. There's Bernie. Now I made the mistake of thinking this represented him coming outside and speaking to the crowd afterwards. This is actually a monitor from him inside being showed to the crowd outside. But in fact, he did come out.
Yes, he did. We actually got to see him up closer and more personal than the people inside. After all the cameras were put away and everybody had left, all the media people left, he came out and talked to us, and I was very impressed with that.
Well, as I started to say a moment ago, I grew up in that area of the California, I know the sports arena, since the time it was built as a modern creative edifice to the time that it now exists, and it holds about 16,000 people, I think. Bernie was attracting that kind of crowd, and people in LA, pretty much word of mouth attendance. People just showed
pretty
up.
much. And the official estimate was 27,000, which was the inside and outside crowd.
So they came from all over the Southern California area, including a bus loaded from Santa Barbara or two.
Right. Yeah. And as far as I know, that's still by far the largest rally of any political candidate for this season.
Campaign.
Yeah, the current campaign.
Well, Bernie's gotten 20,000 crowds in Portland and
Seattle,
in other parts of the country as well. I know 15 to 20,000 is not unusual.
Right. Yeah. And CNN poll before that, I think, already showed that he was ahead of any of the Republican candidates if matched one-on-one. And I think that was very important because the Democratic leadership often says, well, sure, we'd like a more progressive candidate, but we have to be able to win. And so that was laid to rest in this CNN poll that showed that he could beat any of the Republican candidates.
Well, I think that's certainly a hopeful thought, that we're still a year and months away from actual election, and even maybe a half a year or more away from actual primary voting. But the latest polls, as you said, I mean, you mentioned one. I saw one where Hillary Clinton is backed by 42% of the Democratic primary voters, but Bernie was getting 24%, and 22% were going to Biden. So that's a pretty tight race when you think about that, that Hillary Clinton, who is considered to be the odds-on loaded favorite, all the money and all the power, is being closely challenged by two people who haven't really run much of a money campaign.
Yeah, and the thing is that a campaign, the primary campaign is fought state by state, so the national numbers don't even mean anything. You have to look at Iowa and New Hampshire, and Bernie has been ahead of Hillary in the polls in New Hampshire for over a month, as far as I know, and in Iowa it's fairly close.
Well, that's what people make sure people understand, that the bizarre process we have in America for choosing presidents, candidates, is to run primary elections in various states, and the two early states are Iowa, which has a caucus system, which isn't even voting. It's a bizarre meeting, a townhouse meeting kind of thing. Whoever shows up gets to vote. But more importantly, in New Hampshire, right, where there is a real grassroots democracy. And in New Hampshire, say, Bernie Sanders, who is from the neighboring Vermont, is doing well.
But for whatever reason, he has a solid lead now. And his base also has higher energy and loyalty, and that's worth a lot.
Agreed.
Again, a lot of us have been watching Bernie for years and begging him to run. Yeah, begging him to run. So it's not, it's a very different situation than other candidates. And you have to also remember he's a U.S. Senator. This isn't somebody like Ralph Nader, who I certainly supported, who's never held elective office, or even Dennis Kucinich.
Or Donald Trump.
Or even Dennis Kucinich, who is a congressman.
Right.
I will say one thing about Donald Trump and Bernie. They have one thing in common, which is that they are independent of any corporate interests.
So it's an attractive idea.
For exactly opposite reasons.
Yeah, well, it is. I won't get into this too far, but I'm a Philip K. Dick fan, and he had this idea that you should have random selection of people to be presidential. You have a pool of people, and when you need a new president, you grab them out randomly. I like this idea, but anyway. Another thing I think that before I get off the poll subjects, I wanted to mention this, because I think this is really amazing. Clinton's appeal to Democratic women, according to this latest poll, really the last couple of days, has dropped 29 percentage points. As for Bernie Sanders, a recent poll says that Sanders has eked out a slight lead, 42 to 38% over women voters in the Democratic primary. All of these things that we're discussing, the motivation of his crowds, the enthusiasm of his people, the the fact that he's actually appealing to more women than Hillary is amazing. So makes one think, you get this little rush of enthusiasm that this time we got a chance. But as we mentioned on email and cross emails, we both remember, I with probably more bitterness than you, the campaign of another man whom I think is very analogous to this, of Gene McCarthy.
No, I certainly remember Gene McCarthy. My parents were big Gene McCarthy supporters. I actually got to meet Gene McCarthy years later. One of my activist causes is shorter work time. After the Watts riots, 50 years ago, Gene McCarthy headed a committee to study the cause of the riots and how to prevent this. And one of the conclusions was a guaranteed job for every American was one of the solutions. And one of the ways to guarantee a job for every American was to shorten work time, which had been going on in Europe for years. And it was interesting that the Bernie Sanders rally happened the same week as the 50th anniversary commemoration of the Watts riots. And I wrote to the NBC News. I'm one of the few people who actually watches the corporate news still.
I do.
To stay on top of the misinformation they put out. And it was quite impressive that they interviewed somebody who said, well, you know, none of the promises after the Watts riots were fulfilled. And then they went on to the next story, and I wrote to them and I said, one of the promises was a guaranteed job for every American. And the Republicans and the Democrats were both on board with that. And you completely failed to cover the one candidate who had a record turnout in Los Angeles talking about that very issue.
Yeah. The Watts riots 50 years ago. I was resident in the district that was sealed off because of the riot. I was inside the perimeter zone, living there, and I remember the disaster and the bizarre, surreal experience of being there in the summer, in the beautiful, warm summer's evening with pyres of smoke coming off in various places on the horizon, but other people out walking their dogs and watering their lawns. It was really an amazing place to be.
I grew up in D.C., and so we had our version of it, and we never stopped going into town during everything smoldering and burning. Yeah.
But Gene McCarthy, let's come back to Gene. I got clean for Gene. That was the promise of the quote unquote. I wasn't really a hipster hippie, but the idea was that we were supposed to make ourselves look more presentable and become part of the Democratic Party and organize ourselves in a way that would legitimize student anti-war protests and student progressive ideas into the mainstream of the Democratic Party through the official process by primary elections. And we did. We worked hard. And then, of course, when McCarthy, as I remember correctly, did well in New Hampshire, I think it was, LBJ withdrew within a few days after that, whom Gene McCarthy was attacking because of the war policies. And the end result was that Gene McCarthy looked like he had a momentary chance to become president of the United States, but RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, then jumped in full force and pretty much took the air out of the room with the Kennedy machine. And you know, I want to carry that story on just for those of you who are interested in the bizarre courses of history. RFK ran against Gene McCarthy in a big knockdown election in Los Angeles that June, and RFK won, only to be killed that very night, assassinated that very night in Los Angeles. Again, in my neighborhood, all part of the trauma and bizarreness of that time of my life. So Gene McCarthy was then shunted aside, and Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic nominee. And so now I'm going back. Where are we headed now? If Hillary Clinton, who seems to me to be the, if you will, the LBJ model in a way, the establishment Democrat,
or the Hubert Humphrey model,
or the Hubert Humphrey
but
model.
I think we have that bit of history to remind people we're not going to put up with that again. And Bernie Sanders' support just stays solid and keeps growing despite being completely ignored by the corporate media and the hostility of the insiders in the Democratic Party. And I think that when he wins the nomination and when he wins the presidency, I think it's going to really change the entire power structure in the country, because all of the people who held the reins of power realize they don't really hold the reins of power anymore, that the people really have taken control again.
A lot of commentary on Bernie Sanders, and I think this is mean-spirited and petty and probably motivated by the same type of dark forces. But there are people who say, well, Bernie Sanders is a white guy of Jewish ancestry coming from the Northeast, out of rural America, and he has no relationship to Hispanics or minority populations, other minority populations, if you consider Judaism a minority population. But he has no relationship to Hispanics or Asians or blacks. And he's going to have a hard time appealing in states like California and Florida and Texas, where those votes are big.
Yeah, but of course he has the longest and most solid track record of working for civil rights, going back to the 1960s. I believe it was SNCC that he worked with.
Yeah, I probably was at that time. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Right. So he, and not only that, but people who are actually real leaders of in the black community and other minority communities know that the issues that he's talking about are the ones that matter. Even issues like how the police treat black people, in a way, are really secondary to the issue of everybody needs a place in the economy. And that, as I say, we've really gone backwards. In the 1960s, following the riots, even the Republicans realized that full employment is just basic. If you look at Bernie Sanders' policies, he's actually more conservative in many ways than the Republican mainstream was in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, sure.
You look at Eisenhower, he presided over the biggest public works program in American history. Bernie Sanders isn't even advocating for anything big and visionary. He's just saying we ought to fix what we've got. Mm-hmm. His proposal is pretty much just what the Civil Engineer Organization advocates, which is $1 trillion to clear the backlog of all of the broken things in our infrastructure that need fixing. Yeah. And that, of course, would put, I think it was 13 million good-paying jobs.
Jobs that can't be exported also.
Jobs that can't be exported, which is very important. And again, he's fairly much in the tradition of Eisenhower. Eisenhower was definitely protectionist, cared more about American jobs. Mm-hmm. And Eisenhower proudly campaigned that he was strengthening unions in America. People forget that was the mainstream of the Republican Party.
Well, so many commentators observed that today Ronald Reagan would be probably to the left of Hillary Clinton in many ways in some of his politics.
In some ways. Yeah, I would certainly say that Nixon is to the left of Obama. Nixon wanted full employment. Nixon wanted a true universal health care system. Right. Bernie Sanders is not calling for socialized medicine. What he's calling for is exactly the same as what Nixon called for.
The Republican Party.
Which was simply that Medicare should cover everybody.
Yeah, not get too far off that one, but the insurance companies are making the gazillions of dollars off of the Obamacare programs.
Right.
And it's certainly not socialized medicine by any standard of any society anywhere in the world. Let's talk about it. You mentioned one of the strong platform that you think Sanders is supporting is the infrastructure development, and it makes sense. They spend American money back in America to make the country more efficient and to get people good jobs. What else are the things that you think?
Well, as I say, to me, he's not being bold enough, because to me, the civilized world has had high-speed rail now for over 50 years. If we start building high-speed rail tomorrow, we are still 60 years behind the rest of the world in terms of when we're starting to build high-speed rail. And and he doesn't have any really visionary programs like we had in the Kennedy era about science and technology. I'd like to see more of that. But he does have this sort of big no-brainer program of put everybody to work rebuilding the infrastructure. Number 2 on his 12-point list is reversing climate change, which is another no-brainer. I mean, I first started talking about climate change in 1981, and it was already well established that this was an urgent issue, certainly by the mid-'80s. And again, even the Republican Party was on board that something had to be done. We forget those things. So this is, again, it's kind of no-brainer stuff that we urgently have to build sustainable energy and sustainable transportation systems.
Yeah, so we're comfortable with those things. I am assuming, and I know this to be true, but I'm just going to give you a chance to discuss it. There's a huge hostility in this country toward unions, especially government unions, but all kinds of unions, certainly on the Republican side. I have seen not one Republican candidate defend the right of people to organize in unions. They did defend minimum wage in a couple
Well,
of
I'll
them.
say this about that. So, as one of our presidents wants, let me say this about that. So, people, if you ask people what is the largest exporting nation in the world, almost everybody gets that wrong. I'm not sure if I should even ask you.
I would say the largest exporting the trade balance.
Yes.
Well, we export a lot of product, raw materials and
The net export.
But I'm surprised if our net export is more than our net import.
Well, anyway, the largest exporting country in the world is Germany.
Yeah, well, they were until Volkswagen came along.
Okay, well, we'll see what it is next year. But for years now, Germany has been the largest exporting nation in the world. Germany has the strongest union system in the world. Those are not a coincidence. Germany has the best of all worlds of union strength. Germany, one of the only complaints that people can say about our union system is, well, the workers should have their choice of whether or not to be in the union. In Germany, the workers do have a choice whether or not to be in the union, which means the unions have to do well by the workers. And the German law requires that the board of every corporation has to have union representation on the board.
But if I remember correctly, the VW factories in the United States are not unionized.
Oh yeah, a lot of sure.
I mean, we're getting off track here, but
no. The important point is that in Germany they have strong unions and they're the biggest exporter in the world. The point is that having a strong union is not only good for the workers; it's good for the corporation as well. You end up having this very strong bond between the workers and the corporate interest, which we do not have at all in this country.
The places where a president can have impact on the ability of unions to be to survive are the appointment of the members of the labor relations boards.
Well, there's one policy that would make all the difference, which is which he lays out, which is that and Obama promised this when he was campaigning, that workers should be able to privately sign a card that says, I want to join the union.
Right.
The same as any other vote that you have in this country. But the way it works now is that there is no private vote, and it's all has to be done with lobbying back by the corporation.
So making it easier to vote and select a union without the pressures would increase the willingness of workers to identify with unions.
Absolutely, yeah.
Other policies that he makes that you think are particularly valuable to the progress of the working class and middle class in our society.
I'll reiterate the importance of true universal health care because true universal health care is one of the biggest obstacles to employers hiring employees. It's a huge obstacle to innovation that there's any connection at all between health care and employment.
And how would Mr. Sanders...
He would make one line of legislation. Medicare now, the eligibility age is 0. From birth, so you are covered by Medicare.
For all.
He also wants to make college free for all at all public college.
Let's make that
colleges.
clear then. Get something that's dramatically not thought about too much. When I grew up in California, the in-place knowledge I had as a high school student in California was that I could go to any state university if I wanted to, and my qualifications allowed me to go, and there was always someplace I could go on one level or another, and it would be essentially tuition free. I understood that as a birthright of being in California. From a high school graduate in California, go to a university in California without cost. Now, I went to a private university by chance, but later, but that was for scholarships. But the point being, I had that choice. It's a hugely liberating experience to know that you have that choice and that you'll leave college without $60,000 of debt, which will burden you for the rest of your professional life. And Bernie's going to go back to that idea of free college education.
That's right. I mean, the situation for employment now is very different than when we were kids.
Yes.
Now you have to have a college degree for almost any employment. And as far as it also involves another one of his issues, which is financing of everything that we do in our society. We talked about major debt. The financial sector is supposed to just be a small sector of the economy in order to facilitate other parts of the economy. Now it has become a major part of the economy. He wants to restore financing to be a small part of the economy.
And it should be really the service sector. It should be a servicing sector to allow people to manufacture products or produce something of value, not of itself being the most profitable place to make money, which is, of course, what it has become. It has become the Wall Street candidates. Okay, we're getting down to a minute and a half or so. Let's talk one other issue that you think makes Bernie Sanders stand out as a probable winner and the best candidate.
Well, almost, as far as I know, every one of his policies polls a majority of Americans. Mm-hmm. He talks about real tax reform, and the majority of Americans agree that the high end don't pay enough and the low end pays too much, and he would level that out.
Yeah, I'd like people to go online and look into this further because we are running down toward the end here. You can get to the Bernie Sanders websites pretty well, and this list of 12 campaign proposals is certainly there. Other campaign proposals there, but I just want to mention also that I'm still registered Green. I still think the Green Party has a claim to these issues that Bernie is following, and I don't think they have an exclusive right to them. But there's a candidate, Jill Stein, who has been running for Green Party offices, and she's extremely talented and qualified. I hope you go online and look into her website and the party and the positions the Green Party has demonstrated. This show is going to be on the air on Ustream and YouTube, the Next Step TV Santa Barbara, TVSB, Ustream or YouTube, the Next Step TVSB. Google that. You can come up with the next airings of this show. It'll be on for a few weeks. And I really want to thank Robert for this, always too short of an interview, but and the people in the back, thank you for your work. We're going to get off the air now. Thanks all.
Thank you.